And welcome to Container Days, hosted partially with Kubecon EU. This is our lead up to Kubecon, and we're so excited you're here. I already see a bunch of people in chat from all over the world, which is great to see. We got Chicago, we got London. Let us know where you're at and where you're watching. I am your host for today, Justin Garrison, and this event is actually going to be multiple days. We have a couple hours each day. Just hosting different topics around Kubernetes, around EKS, around AWS, all for you to learn new things, hopefully, and get some experience. We got tons of demos, and I'm excited for it. And then some of us are going to KubeCon EU. So if you're in the area, definitely say hi. And with me today is Chris. Hey, Chris, how's it going?
I'm doing great, Justin. How are you doing, man?
I'm doing fine. It's a little early on the Pacific, West Coast, but it's it's work time, so we're ready to go.
Yeah, awesome. Hey, everybody, I'm Chris Short, author of EKS News, DevOps-ish, and also Cloud Native Computing Foundation Ambassador. I'm here at AWS with Justin on the developer advocate team here for EKS, and I'm going to kick it over to Kat so she can introduce herself.
Hey, y'all. My name is Kat. It is not early in the morning where I am because I am doing this from Edinburgh. But I am a staff developer advocate at Pulumi, and more importantly and relevant to our conversation, I was on the comms team for the most recent Kubernetes release, so may have some additional insight and was part of the dockershim docs deprecation project.
Yes, I was part of that as well. I should have thrown that in. Thank you, Kat.
Yeah, and today we did want to talk about dockershim and why it's being removed. And Kat, you kind of got this reputation of being the harbinger of dockershim removal.
Sorry.
Yeah, it happens. So, like, you know, in Irish folklore, there's a thing called a banshee, right? And when a banshee wails, it means like somebody near you is going to die. But I tweet, and then a feature gets deprecated from Kubernetes. That was an accident, but yeah, the initial dockershim deprecation announcement was made, and it wasn't communicated super well. Like as a community, we did not do a great job of talking about that change initially, so it created a lot more panic than was necessary. And myself and Ian Coldwater unfortunately became the faces of helping to correct that communication disaster, which is why I ended up here and why I ended up so involved in the eventual removal of the feature.
And real quick, let's just talk about why this is actually a big deal, because a lot of people may not have that full context of, from the very beginning of Kubernetes, Docker was a key part of how containers ran everywhere. This wasn't pluggable. This wasn't all these features that we have now. So why is removing that, the dockershim specifically, why is that important?
So originally, like you said, there was only one container runtime you could use with Kubernetes, and it was the entire Docker tech stack. But eventually, we added some support for different container runtimes, that some of which don't even exist anymore, like Kubernetes.
Rocket was amazing.
And Rocket.
Rocket's actually deprecated too.
Rocket's deprecated too, right? But it became clear from then that like users wanted they wanted the ability to like plug and play whatever container runtime that met their needs. And so we implemented the CRI, and it created like a standard for like how container runtimes work within Kubernetes and how we interact with them. Unfortunately, the Docker support is from before CRI was implemented, so it doesn't comply with this new standard. And the problem that caused is that we were effectively developing a lot of plugins and things twice. We would implement something for the CRI standard, and then we would have to implement it in maybe a slightly different way for Docker, which was kind of a developmental burden that was unnecessary. And part of that is the existence of the dockershim, which is just this little software shim that allows you to access the instance of containerd that already exists within the Docker tech stack and use that runtime rather than just using containerd directly. And it became a maintenance nightmare, is what it boils down to.
And there was 2 SIGs that had to work on it. There was actually a great talk. They've been talking about doing this since 2017 at the earliest, I think, is
Many
the
years.
most.
Yeah.
Yeah, like it has been a struggle to maintain this thing, and now that it's not just deprecated but removed in the latest 124 release, it actually decreases the developer burden to an extent.
Radically, yeah.
Like, I mean, just
for
those 2
maintainers,
SIGs,
especially.
yeah, and if you just write to the CRI standard, you're good, and you're off and running. And there's a lot more container runtimes available as a result.
Yep.
And
you can use Container D, you can use Cryo, whatever else is hanging out there. Fine.
And with that portability of containers, like why should people care that Docker is being removed? Like what is the big deal about removing the dockershim for an end user of Kubernetes?
For an end user, I would ideally hope that they don't notice because their cluster admins are the ones taking care of this.
Right. Hopefully.
So,
what about workloads?
Workloads, you basically need to make sure you're not, mounting volumes using the Docker socket, right? Like that's the biggest thing. Make sure that your container runtime of choice, be it Cryo, be it, Container D, just make sure that's available, running, and it can handle everything else from there.
Yeah, we went through a lot of effort to put together a lot of like migration documentation and make sure that you're not affected by this upcoming removal tutorials. There's more than one article right now on the Kubernetes documentation or on the blog that details like what you need to do to make sure that you don't have a Docker dependency. And the answer is like it's usually pretty quick to tell if you have a Docker dependency. Like they don't hide exactly. So,
which is good, but there were still, when you talk about a lot of work, right? Like I lost count at the bespoke configuration of Kubernetes clusters I was building because of what needed to be updated in the docs, right? Like I had some weird combinations of like CRI and Kubernetes version and, network and everything just to prove out that what was written in the docs before can still work now with, Container D as the default or Cryo as the default.
But if you do need to keep using like the whole Docker tech stack as your runtime for whatever reason, Mirantis and Docker, the company, did decide to jointly support and like continue maintaining the dockershim. It's now called CRI Docker D, and you could just they have documentation on how to use it, but you can keep using the Docker stack as your runtime. You shouldn't, but you totally can. So,
and this is still there.
You shouldn't notice a difference because right now, Container D is under the hood of Docker.
Yes.
Yeah. And it wasn't originally.
No,
like,
it was not.
That came later. But the main reason here that people are doing this, why they want to mount the Docker socket, is typically for building containers or getting some access to that Docker. Like you need metrics, you need something else that you want to run Docker in Docker. And you can do that in Kubernetes by mounting this volume and you're ready to go. You just do your normal Docker commands. And that goes away.
And that blows up now.
And so alternatives now are, instead of mounting the Docker socket, are either move to different build tools if you want something that doesn't require the Docker socket. If you're building your containers inside of Kubernetes, use something else that is either daemonless or not Docker socket based, right?
Yep. Like there are alternatives.
What are the other things that might get end users for like, hey, now, I mean, we know we can't build containers using the Docker daemon anymore. And we can't get metrics from running Docker commands if we have some sort of exporter or metrics that was relying on that socket for information. Is there anything else that users might be missing?
I think there is a piece of documentation on like what to do with observability tools that might have Docker dependencies. That is linked in one of the recent Kubernetes.io blogs.
And that's actually where I was leading right here is bringing up the actual FAQ, because this was great. There's an older version from 2020 and this new version from 2022 that goes into all these details on exactly, what you might want to look out for as an end user and what you can do to mitigate some of those things.
Are you looking at the one that I wrote?
I think this is the group edited one.
Yeah, this is
Okay.
the FAQ.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was gonna send
Yeah.
this in chat real fast.
There's also, let me drop this here so you can send it in chat as well. This one goes through everything that you need to take a look at to make sure that your cluster is ready for 124. From like whether or not you think this might affect you to like how to actually see if it does, and then what to do if it does affect you. So
switch tabs back to this comment. There we go. Send that in chat. And that's actually where we wanted to go with this as well, is we want to make sure that users are just confident that they're not going to have a problem. If you're going to upgrade to Kubernetes 124, we want to make sure that you're ready, your workloads are ready, and that you have confidence that like, yeah, no, we can move to Kubernetes 124. There's always new features. There's always bug fixes. There's a lot of value in doing that, and waiting for a container runtime or being worried about your container runtime shouldn't be the thing that holds you up.
Right. And like it is entirely possible to move to 124 and be confident that it's not going to cause your clusters to fall over. There just is some stuff you have to check first, right?
And the very first thing that I wrote this plugin for Kubectl not long ago is called Detector for Docker Socket. I'm just calling it DDS. And all it does is it looks at your workloads if they're mounting the Docker socket or not. And so
that's neat.
I'm trying to, I can't get that GIF bigger. I will drop this link in here once I copy it properly. But this is, it's just Kubectl install DDS, and it's going to look at all of the workloads in your cluster. It's going to see all the volumes, and for every workload type, it'll find the higher level thing. So if you have a deployment with 100 pods, it'll find the one deployment spec that you would need to modify, and it'll just notify you, hey, it's mounted. And that's all it's doing. It's just reading all your workloads, finding the top level thing, and then letting you know if it's mounted or not.
That's really cool.
Yeah, and you could run it in CI. You could run it, on your desktop if need be, right? It just depends on your configuration.
If you have a manifest file locally as well, you can pass -F to it, and it'll show you, it'll show mounted, and then it'll show you which files and what line of each file. So you have a repository of GitOps YAML files, and you just throw this tool at it. It'll recursively look at all of your YAML files and find which ones are mounting a volume named Docker sockets, and let you know these files have that volume. So you may want to take care of that before you upgrade to Kubernetes 124, or before you deploy this to a cluster that may not have the dockershim or the Docker socket available.
That's rad. Thanks for doing that.
Yeah.
It was a gap that when I was talking to people last year, and this isn't even something that's 124 specific. You can run this on any cluster. This isn't like, hey, I need to wait for 124. No, if you have a 119 cluster now, like go ahead and run it.
And it's a crew plugin, right? Right. So yeah, it's part of your standard Kubernetes crew plugin library, right?
Yeah. So if you're using crew for these plugins, you go ahead and you just install this piece and figure out, which workloads are going to be affected. And that was kind of the key, was just people don't know. And these containers and the clusters are getting so big. There's so many workloads, and you just, no one had confidence. And so we needed some way just to tell people like, hey, by the way, check this one out. Just look at it at a time.
Yeah, the last thing we want is your entire production application to keel over because you had one line that reference to Docker socket, right? Like, there needed to be a tool out there that said, hey, we can detect this either in a running cluster or in files. And Justin, thank you so much for taking the time to build it, to open source it, and not just do it, but do it very quickly ahead of the release so that folks could start looking at this.
Yeah, we were just trying to get it out there because it was something that when I remember, Kat, when there was so much blowback when you started tweeting about it, and I was just like, as a cluster admin, I wouldn't know. And when I started talking to more and more people in the community, like, what do we need? What do we need to give people confidence that, like, hey, this is gonna be okay. Like, we're gonna get through this. Your workloads are still gonna work. Kubernetes is still a great place to run containers. How do we make sure that that's okay for everyone?
Yeah, it was really, really dramatic. And a lot of it was just around people like not understanding what was happening and why. And like, I honestly, a lot of the panic came from people who weren't cluster admins, right? They were developers.
Yeah, they used Docker on their desktop.
Yeah, they use Docker locally in dev, but you know, the conflation of terms there made things easy to misinterpret.
And like, there's this long history of people learning Docker, then learning Kubernetes as well.
Yeah, which is what I did.
Right,
That's,
same thing.
you know,
and totally traditional route of learning things. But like, for example, we were just in a SigDocs dockershim meeting, and oh yeah, we're still pointing to docker.io to install container D in places, right? Like, that's not the best place to install it from. It's so ingrained in the Kubernetes like ecosystem that Docker is a part of Kubernetes. It's not, right? Like, it never has been. I mean, like, as far as like Docker desktop, you know, the Docker shim itself, yes, totally a part of Kubernetes and totally there to interface with your Docker sockets and everything else. But the two projects are not connected other than like this one intersection point of, oh yeah, I use Docker to build my containers elsewhere.
Yeah. And it is worth noting that like you can use a container built by like literally anything inside of Kubernetes. Like any OCI compliant container image will work just fine. It doesn't matter if it was built by Docker or Podman or whatever else exists out there. And that was part of the confusion, right? Like, some people thought that like Docker as a whole entire company tool name was going away. Right. And they were like, how do I build my containers then? Like, what do I do in dev? What do I switch to? Like, you don't, you're fine. So naming things is important and hard.
Yeah. And go ahead.
What if we called it the Moby shim? Right? Maybe that would have been more clear, but probably not.
Maybe that would have been better. I don't know. Probably not.
Yeah. Like, we would have had to rename a bunch of stuff and it probably would have been harder. And even more confusing to deprecate.
But I mean, the container naming, you know, overlap goes back a long time before Kubernetes. And this isn't just something that's specific to Kubernetes, but it's something that Kat and Chris, like, you both worked a lot on getting documentation ready by telling people about these things, by making sure everyone was aware. This is going to be okay. This is just what you need to do or what you need to check. And let's make sure we move on from here, because I guarantee you in another 4 or 5 years, there's going to be something else that's...
Oh, there will be.
Oh, and, totally.
Yeah. I mean, we're still feeling the burn from the V1 beta one.
Yeah.
You know, like that was
stable
a while ago, and like that's still kind of painful, right? So yeah, something else will come up that's going to be hopefully less dramatic than this, but with just as much potential to impact the community, right? Because it's just the Kubernetes project is younger than it feels.
Yes,
right?
It is.
Like, it's considerably younger than it feels. Like, so much relies on it that it feels like it should be this like big, like reliable, ancient legacy system, but it's not. It's a toddler.
Yeah.
Right.
Basically. It stumbles around and doesn't necessarily know when to go to the bathroom, when not to go to the bathroom, that kind of thing, right? Like, it's it is a newer project. It is very viable, right? Like,
very. It's not going away anytime soon, but it's gonna have a couple of growth spurts, you know, and this was one of them.
And also this release also turned off beta features by default, the 124 release, which will save us from a lot of pain in the future as well. But we have to turn off beta features everywhere, you know, that kind of thing. And
I think that's a great change, by the way. Like, that's an incredible quality of life thing moving forward. Yeah.
Totally.
Real thrilled about that one.
So from both of you going through this whole process, especially with, I mean, a lot of it was user communication, right? Like, the development side of it was just like, yeah, we have to get rid of this. What are the lessons learned, you think, from this that we can take with us in the future on the project itself and within the community?
You know, I did a whole talk about this at KubeCon with Ian Coldwater. And what it kind of boiled down to was that we assumed incorrectly that the community had the same level of knowledge and understanding of the way Kubernetes works under the hood and the history of how it has worked under the hood. And that assumption is what ruined us. We should have talked to the community.
Yeah.
We should have communicated more clearly. We should not have assumed that the entire community was also made up of experts who had been there since the dawn of time. So a lot of it is remembering that not everybody has the context that we have, and that's just going to get worse as time goes on, right?
Mhm.
Like there are Kubernetes users now that weren't using Kubernetes when the dockershim deprecation was announced. So this removal, they may be wondering like, why are we doing this? They have zero context, and that's going to happen again.
Oh yeah.
So
I mean, and this is part of the reason why the contributor comms team was created, was to get out in front of these issues to an extent. But like literally the dockershim deprecation and the forming of that contributor comms team kind of happened at similar timeframes, similar timelines.
mhm.
So all the work that has been done through just that team, of which I'm a technical advisor to, has helped, right? Like get the message out there, continue to get the message out there, right? Like
Yep.
constantly drive home this, oh, wait, there's an FAQ that now says is outdated. We need to update that. Like that came from us looking around during the contributor comms meeting. It's pretty awesome.
It's a lot of little things to manage too. Like stuff like that is so easy to miss, and it's a lot to keep an eye on. So
I mean, trust me, I can grep the entire code base pretty fast, but that's a lot of code, and
but
it's
a lot of
very
code,
easy to miss like docker-shim, for example, right? Like
Mhm.
There's no
And that's
grep
why,
for community information. Like community information, there's just no command line tool for that. Like you have to
yeah,
just put in the
no,
work.
no, yeah, you just have to put in the work. You just have to like tweet something, do a survey,
Mhm.
like get the community's
And
vibe.
we did do a survey for this feature
We
like
did,
deprecation as well, and
we did,
people by and large weren't necessarily ready or weren't necessarily knowledgeable about the change and what, if anything, they needed to do.
right. Yeah, which is also our fault, but we know that that problem exists now, right? So we can perhaps avoid it in the future, or at least make it
That's
less bad, because we're never going to be able to like get to everybody, right? That's just not feasible. But we can reduce the potential impact of a feature change like this in the future, knowing what we know now.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. And I mean, all the information, the docs, FAQs, like the intention is to let them not have to talk to us, right? Like they should be able to go find the thing easily that they're trying to do and not have to know deep knowledge of Kubernetes
Yeah,
history, lore, and so like, oh well, back in my day it was this. It's like, no, like let's
yeah,
just solve your problem of running containers at scale and figure out
right.
how that works best for you in your context with your workloads. Yeah, we have a lot of moving parts. We have a lot of communities and SIGs and everything else that need to coordinate to make that happen at this scale of open source. But
Hmm.
let's go ahead and make sure that you are unblocked, and we write a lot of documentation and we try to get as much information in as many channels as possible to find and meet all of those people that we have never talked to that are learning Kubernetes today. And those are the people that are just as important as the people who have been using Kubernetes for 3 years. And we need
Yep.
to make sure both of them are up to date and are able to be successful with the tools.
Yeah, and
Good
somebody
stuff.
mentioned in chat like pod security policies are going away next, right? Like,
Oh
but
yeah,
we are
that little
getting like
piece.
you've already seen some of the lessons learned from the Docker shim discussion
Yeah,
and
and we've
its
had like
fallout. Yeah, you're
it,
starting to see some of those lessons learned play out, right? Like we're way out in front of the pod security
way out in
policy
front of that.
deprecation.
Like, yeah, like there were talks at KubeCon Los Angeles about
Mhm.
the PSP deprecation. So like, yeah, we're trying very hard to stay ahead of that one, because that
Yeah,
also
like
has the potential to be dramatic, right?
oh yeah, like the whole reason I started beating on the drum was literally a customer said, "Yeah, we just finished implementing all these pod security policies." Like the
Mm,
day I was talking to them, I learned that PSPs were going away. So it was like, "Oh my gosh." It's
yeah,
like we need to get the word out there this is going away because it's going to take them 24 months to fix this. Right? Just the way their enterprise, security teams work sometimes, right? So, yeah, started
yeah.
beating the drum on that very early as a result of the lessons learned from dockershim's deprecation.
Yeah.
Thanks for that, because geez.
Yeah.
We can't dive into it. We have two minutes left.
Mhm.
But yeah, it goes to, I mean, technology moves fast. And if you're trying to keep secure, up to date with all the features, like it has to move fast. But enterprise and big infrastructure and applications that rely on it, it's move a bit slower, and you have to kind of match with that pace to make sure that, hey, let's not lose trust or forget about a bunch of users that really want to use the tools, and make sure that they have the information and tools they need to move forward.
Yeah, in an absence of tooling,
heavy sigh. That was a
get a
year
lot
of a sigh.
Yeah, I mean, when no tool exists, that's a problem. When thousands of tools exist, that's not a problem anymore. It's a solved problem, right? So, I mean, we've already seen Kyverno kind of come up, for I think sandbox or incubation, I forget.
I'll look it up while you're talking.
Yeah, I think it's sandbox, but we're starting to see projects in the space, kind of get into the ecosystem of tooling and make themselves known. Hey, yes, pod security is a thing, but we also do this, and it might be a better way for your org, right? Like more options is better, in my opinion.
Yes, Kyverno is sandbox currently.
Mm-hmm. Will we have any kind of LTS version? No. Explicitly, no.
Nope, we're not doing that here.
No. If anything, right, like ask your, provider about like version support. But the project itself will not have an LTS version. No.
I think that's just a philosophy we decided on a while ago, that it just is not how we want to operate.
We would have to basically take the Kubernetes community and then duplicate it. Right.
Yeah.
Right. Like it would take as much effort as the rest of developing Kubernetes to keep an LTS version going, because you have to patch things, you have to release things. It would be so hard.
We're at time for this stream. Anyone that's watching, we have another segment coming up right after this about EKS blueprints. So Terraform, managing EKS clusters. So thank you so much, Katz and Chris, for joining. And we'll be back in just a couple minutes after a quick video.